They had been married for 11 years when the silence between them stopped feeling like comfort and began feeling like something else, something without a clean name. Daniel was a man who believed he had built a good life, and in many ways he had. A steady architecture practice, a house with old elm trees in the yard, a wife who had quietly arranged the better parts of his existence while he moved through it, accepting the arrangements as natural. Claire had loved him with the particular devotion of someone who noticed everything, who remembered how he took his coffee in winter versus summer, who knew which silences meant he was thinking and which meant he was retreating, and that noticing had, over years, begun to feel to her like a gift she was giving into an empty room. What neither of them understood, not yet, was that the drift between them had not begun with an event, but with 1,000 small moments of choosing the easier thing, the shorter answer, the deferred conversation, the goodnight set to the ceiling. And into that drift, as drifts tend to invite, something else had quietly sailed. The elm trees had lost most of their leaves by the time Daniel noticed the coffee. Not the coffee itself, the mug. Claire had replaced the blue ceramic mug he'd used for 7 years, the one with the hairline fracture along the handle that she'd superglued twice, with a clean white one from a set her sister had given them 2 Christmases ago. He stood in the kitchen doorway in his socks, looking at the white mug on the counter, and felt something he couldn't classify. Not grief, exactly. More like the faint disorientation of returning to a room and sensing that a piece of furniture has been moved an inch. He said nothing. He poured his coffee and opened his laptop at the kitchen table. This was a Saturday in October, and the house held the particular stillness of weekend mornings. The furnace cycling on, the neighbor's dog 2 yards over, the sound of Claire upstairs running the shower. Daniel scrolled through project files without reading them. He was working on a commission for a medical complex outside the city, a building that was supposed to feel, according to the brief, both efficient and humane. He had been stuck on it for 3 weeks. The two qualities he kept finding did not want to coexist. Claire came downstairs in her robe, her hair damp, and moved through the kitchen with the fluid economy of someone who knew every inch of a space. She refilled her own mug, also white from the same set, and sat across from him without comment on the laptop. "Margaret called," she said. "About Thanksgiving." "About Thanksgiving." Claire wrapped both hands around the mug. "She wants to do it at their place this year. I said I'd ask you." "Fine with me." I told her that's probably what you'd say. There was nothing sharp in her voice. That was the thing about Claire. She rarely sharpened her words deliberately. What sharpness existed lived in the precision of her observations, in the slight pause before "that's probably what you'd say" that carried if you were listening for it. The full archaeology of a person who had learned not to expect much in the way of surprise. Daniel looked up from the screen. She was looking out the window at the yard, at the elm trees dropping their last leaves onto the dead grass. "Is that okay?" he said. "Their place." "It's fine, Daniel." He went back to the screen. She went back to the window. The furnace cycled off and the house was briefly very quiet. They had met at 26 at a mutual friends gallery opening, one of those mid-sized city events where everyone is performing a version of themselves they hope will eventually become accurate. Daniel had been performing confidence. Claire had not been performing anything, which was what caught him. She was standing in front of a large abstract canvas, a glass of wine at her hip, looking at it with the focused, slightly impatient expression of someone who was genuinely trying to decide what she thought. He'd stood beside her and said something half clever about the painting. She'd glanced at him, considered for a moment, and said, "I think it's trying too hard to look like it isn't trying." He'd laughed, really laughed, and she'd smiled. Not the smile of someone pleased by their own wit, but of someone relieved to have been understood. He had built the first 2 years of their marriage around the memory of that quality in her. The secondary character arrived in November, not dramatically, but the way most things arrive, as a fact that has already been true for some time before it becomes visible. His name was Marcus Hale. He worked in urban planning for the city, and Claire had known him professionally for 4 years. since a mixed-use development project had required extended collaboration between her firm and his office. Daniel had met him twice, once at a work function Claire had brought him to, and once at a dinner party where Marcus had arrived alone and spent most of the evening in conversation with the host's husband about cycling routes. Daniel had no particular impression of him. That was, looking back, part of it. Claire mentioned Marcus on a Tuesday. In passing, she had run into him at the market. They had talked for 20 minutes. He was thinking of leaving the city planning office to consult independently. "Good for him," Daniel said, from behind the medical complex drawings. "I thought so too," Claire said. She set a plate of crackers and cheese on the table beside him, a small habit she had when he was working late, an offering that required no acknowledgement, and went upstairs to read. Daniel ate 2 crackers without looking up from the drawings. He did not notice that she had used the good cheese, the kind she usually saved, or that she had arranged it with more care than the gesture required. The hairline crack in the ordinary day was this. Later that night, past 11, he came upstairs and found her already asleep. Or arranged as though asleep, her book closed on the nightstand, the lamp on her side already out. He undressed in the dark and got into bed and lay on his back in the particular silence of 2 people in the same bed, breathing at different rhythms, both awake, neither speaking. After a long moment, Claire said without turning over, "Did you eat the crackers?" "Yes," he said. "Thank you." A pause. "Good," she said. And that was the end of the conversation, and Daniel lay in the dark believing it was nothing, and it was nothing, and it was everything. December came and the elm trees were bare sticks against a gray sky. Daniel was at his drafting table on a Wednesday evening when he realized that he and Claire had not had a real conversation. Not the kind where you follow a thread somewhere you haven't been in, perhaps 6 weeks. The recognition arrived without alarm. That was its own kind of alarm. He tried to trace back. There had been words, certainly. Logistics, mostly. The Thanksgiving plan, a leaking bathroom fixture, whether to keep the cleaner coming bi-weekly or monthly, a discussion about Claire's mother's health that had required brief emotional attention and received it, but a conversation. The kind that ran long and sideways and ended somewhere unexpected. He could not find one. He was not entirely sure whose failure that was. Claire, for her part, had stopped expecting those conversations, and was not certain when she had made that adjustment. What she knew was that for several years she had experienced her marriage as a place she could fully inhabit, and at some point, gradually, unannounced, it had become a place she visited. She had not said this to anyone. She had not entirely said it to herself. What she had said to Marcus, across a small table at a coffee shop in mid-November, was this: "I think people forget to keep being curious about each other." Marcus had looked at her over his cup. What does that look like? When they forget. They start answering questions before the other person finishes asking them. He had been quiet for a moment, and then, "That's very specific." "Yes," she'd said. "It is." She had walked home from that coffee with her coat collar up against the December cold, feeling not guilty, not precisely, but seen, which was a sensation so long unfamiliar that she'd had trouble identifying it at first, and had stood at her own front door for a moment before putting in the key. The 3 of them were briefly in the same room in mid-December at the winter reception for Claire's firm. It was the kind of industry event that required attendance rather than enthusiasm, a rented gallery space, catered wine, architects and planners making professional small talk against a backdrop of someone's geometric prints. Daniel stood with Claire's colleague Renata and talked about load-bearing walls with the committed purposefulness of a man who needed something to do with his hands. Across the room, Claire was talking with Marcus and 2 others from the planning office. Daniel watched them once, not with suspicion, but with something adjacent, something he didn't examine, and noted that she was laughing at something Marcus had said. It was the laugh that moved through her shoulders first, the one he had known since 26. He looked away. Renata was saying something about cantilevered structures. "Right," he said. "The cantilever." On the drive home, the car quiet and the city lights streaking the windows, Claire said, "You seem distracted tonight." "I was thinking about the medical complex. You're always thinking about the medical complex. It's a complicated project. She turned to look at the window on her side. I know it is. There was something in the pause after that. Not reproach, not resignation, but something that lived in the interval between them. Then she said, lightly, almost to the glass, I don't know. Maybe like this story or subscribe or something. Daniel glanced at her. What? She turned back from the window with a faintly uncertain expression, as though she wasn't entirely sure she'd spoken. Nothing. Never mind. He looked at the road. Are you tired? Yes, she said. I think I am. 3 days later, he found her phone on the kitchen counter while she was outside. He was not looking for anything. He was looking for his own phone and picked hers up by mistake, and in the half-second before he registered the error, he saw the top of a text message thread. Not its content, just the contact name, and the time, Marcus Hale, and a message sent at 11:42 the previous night. He set it down. He found his own phone in his jacket pocket. He stood in the kitchen for a moment. He did not pick her phone up again. What he did instead was go to his drafting table and sit in front of the medical complex drawings for an hour without touching them. He thought about the quality of efficient and humane. He thought about the hairline fracture in the blue mug that Claire had superglued twice before finally replacing it. He thought about what it meant to repair something that you knew would crack again, and he thought about what it meant to stop repairing it. Then he thought, I might be imagining this, and then, I don't think I am. And then he rolled up the drawings carefully, placed them in their tube, and went to make dinner, because it was Wednesday and he usually made dinner on Wednesdays, and he was not yet ready to stop doing the things he usually did. That night, Claire sat across from him at the table and talked about a colleague's maternity leave and the coverage schedule and whether the firm should hire a temporary junior associate. Daniel listened and responded and passed the bread and refilled their glasses. He was entirely present and entirely somewhere else, and she did not notice, or she noticed and did not acknowledge it, and he did not know which. After dinner, she put on a podcast and washed the dishes, and he dried them, standing side by side at the sink the way they had for 11 years, and he was acutely aware of the 6 inches of air between their arms. He did not close it, neither did she. January arrived with a hard frost that lasted 2 weeks, and Daniel asked Claire directly on a Sunday morning while the frost was still on the windows. He had not planned the moment. That was important, somehow, that it had not been prepared. He was standing in the kitchen, making eggs, and Claire was at the table with her laptop, and there was simply a point at which the ordinary morning felt too heavy to carry on its ordinary terms. And he turned from the stove and said, Are you in love with Marcus Hale? The question sat in the kitchen between them. Claire closed her laptop. She did not close it quickly, not as a flinch. She closed it with the deliberate care of someone placing something fragile on a shelf. Then she looked at him. Why are you asking that? Because of the text at 11:40 at night. Because of the way you laugh at things, he says. Because I've been watching you not be here for months, and I think I know where you are instead. He turned back to the eggs so they wouldn't burn. He kept his voice level. This was not the voice he was afraid of, the raised, breaking one. This was the worse voice, the one that had absorbed too much to shout. Claire was quiet for long enough that he plated the eggs and set them on the table and sat down. Then she said, It hasn't been physical. That's not actually what I asked. She looked at the laptop. No, she said, I suppose it isn't. He waited. I don't know what I feel, she said, and the honesty of it, the unwillingness to dress it up, was the thing he had always loved, and now it cost him something to love it. It's not, Daniel, it's not that I went looking for something. It's that I found out something was possible that I'd forgotten was possible. And what was possible? She met his eyes, feeling like someone wanted to know what I thought. The kitchen was very quiet. He could have said, I want to know what you think. The words were available. They sat right there, within reach, and he did not take them, because they would have been true, and they would also have been, in this moment, delivered in response to a wound, a performance of the thing rather than the thing itself, and they both would have known it, and he could not bear that. What he said instead was, Have I been that absent? It was not really a question. Claire looked at her plate. "You've been here," she said quietly. "You've just been somewhere behind here, like the house has been occupied but not lived in. That's not entirely fair. I know I've been under a lot of pressure with the practice. The Aldermore project alone, Daniel." She said his name without sharpness, without anything that could be called accusation. Just a pause, a stopping. "I know. I know you have. I'm not saying you weren't trying. I'm saying that for a long time I felt like a secondary thing in my own life. And I didn't say that, and I should have, and I didn't because—" She stopped. "Because why? Because I didn't want to be the kind of wife who needed that, who said out loud, 'I need you to notice me.'" She pressed her fingers flat against the table. "Because it felt like failure, my own failure." He sat with that. "It rearranged some things. And Marcus notices you," he said. It came out without bitterness, just as a fact being confirmed. "He asks questions," Claire said, "and then he waits for the answer. It sounds small. It doesn't sound small." She looked at him then with something close to grief. Not for Marcus, he understood, but for this, for the space between them that had been filled incrementally with smaller and smaller silences, until there was nothing left to fill. "I haven't done anything I can't come back from," she said. "I want you to know that, but I'm not sure." She stopped again. "Whether you want to." She didn't answer. Which was its own answer. He ate some of the eggs. They had gone cold. She sat with her hands still flat on the table, not eating, not performing composure, just present in the discomfort of it. Which was, he thought, more honest than composure would have been. "I'm going to stay at Patrick's for a while," he said. "I think I need to think." "Okay. Not permanently." "I don't know. Just, I can't think in this house right now. I understand." He finished the eggs. He washed his plate. He went upstairs and packed a bag without urgency. And Claire stayed at the kitchen table. And when he came back downstairs with the bag, she was looking out the window at the frost on the elm trees. And he said, "I'll call you." And she said, "Okay." And he left. The door did not slam. He closed it carefully, which was somehow worse. By March, Claire had reconstructed the events of January into a narrative that was not dishonest but was curated. She told her sister Ellen that she and Daniel were taking some time apart because the marriage had developed a distance neither of them had properly addressed, and that she had, in fairness, developed a close friendship with a colleague that had perhaps indicated where her emotional needs were not being met at home. She said this clearly and without drama. Ellen, who had always found Daniel slightly opaque, received it with the quiet relief of someone who had suspected something without knowing what. What Claire did not tell Ellen, what she had not quite told herself, was the texture of her own complicity in the distance. She had been honest in the kitchen in January, but honesty in crisis is not the same as the ongoing honesty of daily life, and the daily life had been a series of choices to stop asking, to stop pushing, to stop offering the version of herself that needed something and might not receive it. She had protected herself by making herself smaller, and then she had resented Daniel for the smallness of the space she occupied. Marcus, for his part, had been shaken by the conversation he and Claire had, not in the coffee shop way, the easy intellectual circling, but in the real way, when she had told him in February what had happened. He had said, carefully, that he valued her and that he was aware of the particular irresponsibility of what had been growing between them, and that he thought they both needed clarity about what they were actually doing. It was a generous, thoughtful response. Claire had appreciated it enormously and had also recognized in it the shape of a retreat. She did not pursue it. What she did instead was throw herself into a large rezoning project that had come through the firm, working long hours with the self-punishing productivity of someone who needs not to have time to feel things. She became excellent at the project. She was recognized for it. She went to dinner with colleagues and came home to the house that was now entirely hers, and sat in it with a glass of wine and found that the silence which had once pressed in on her now felt not comfortable but honest. There was no performance required in an empty room. Daniel, at Patrick's apartment in the first weeks, had been useless. Patrick was a friend from college who had remained single with the easy contentment of someone who had genuinely decided it suited him, and he received Daniel's presence with the uncomplicated hospitality of someone who asked few questions and kept good whiskey. Daniel sat in Patrick's spare room with the medical complex drawings and worked and did not work, and walked for long periods through the cold city streets at hours when walking is either therapeutic or a symptom. What he was doing, mostly, was auditing. He went back through the last 4 years with the particular ruthlessness of retrospect. He found things he did not like. He had been in the accumulated weight of evidence, absent in the way Claire had described. Not absent like a man who didn't care, but absent like a man who had assumed the caring was understood without transmission. He had believed that the fact of his love was self-evident, that the architecture of their shared life, the house, the routine, the eggs on Wednesday, the continued presence, constituted an expression. He had been, he understood now, confusing a foundation for a conversation. He thought about his father, who had been similarly certain of the self-evidence of things. And he thought about how his mother had described her marriage late in her life as affectionate but lonely. And he sat with that for a long time in Patrick's spare room. He called Claire on Thursdays. The calls were careful, civilized, navigating towards something neither of them named directly. She asked about the medical complex. He asked about the rezoning project. There were moments in the calls when a genuine thing tried to surface. A tone, a half sentence, and then both of them would let it settle back down. Not yet, not ready. In April, the medical complex received final approval. The partners sent a bottle of wine. Daniel looked at the building drawings, the version that had finally reconciled efficient and humane, that had solved its problem by removing a wall he'd been too attached to, and felt a complicated satisfaction. He called Claire to tell her. It was a Thursday. "I'm glad," she said, and he could hear that she was. "I've been thinking," he said, and then stopped. "I know," she said. "Me too." It was not a resolution. It was a door left slightly open, and they both knew it, and neither of them walked through it. By May, Claire had stopped mentally reviewing the conversation in the kitchen, not because she had resolved it, but because she had begun to understand that some conversations don't resolve. They just become part of the architecture of a person. She was 39. She had 11 years of marriage in her, and a year of slow unraveling and a quiet spring in an emptier house. And she was beginning to understand the difference between the life she had curated and the life she actually wanted, and those two things were not as far apart as her worst nights had suggested, but not as close as her reconstructed narrative had implied. She had lunch with Marcus once in late April, carefully, with full awareness on both sides of what had and hadn't happened and what the reasonable thing was. He was kind. She was honest. They agreed to keep things at the respectful professional distance that was probably always where they should have been, and she walked back to her office feeling neither heartbroken nor redeemed, but simply clear, which was its own unfamiliar thing. That night she called Daniel. It was a Tuesday, not a Thursday. "I think we should talk," she said. "In person, not on the phone." A pause. Then, "Okay. Yes. Where do you want to?" "Here," she said. "Come home." He came on a Saturday in early June, when the elm trees were fully leafed out and the yard looked like it always did in summer. Overgrown and particular, the way things look when they belong to a specific place. Claire was in the kitchen when he came in with his key. He still had his key. She had not asked for it, and he had not returned it, and neither of them had spoken about that. But it sat now in the air between them as a quiet data point about the nature of the past 7 months. She had made coffee, 2 mugs, the white ones from the set. He sat down across from her, and for a moment they simply existed in the kitchen together in the summer morning quiet. And there was something in that simple fact that neither of them were willing to interrupt too quickly. "You look well," he said. "You do too." She wrapped her hands around the mug. Better than in January. January was. He let it go. "Yes," she said. The elm tree shadow moved across the kitchen floor in the light breeze. He looked at it. She looked at him. "I've been thinking about what you said," he told her. "In January, about the house being occupied but not lived in." He paused. I've been thinking about that for 6 months. I know you have. I think it was true. And I think I've been trying to understand how it happened, and I don't have a clean answer. I think I was afraid of needing things, visibly, and I made that your problem without knowing I was doing it. Claire was quiet, not performing quiet, actually thinking. I wasn't blameless, she said. I made myself smaller and then was angry about the smallness. I should have said things long before January. You tried sometimes. I tried softly. I should have tried louder. I should have been easier to reach. The coffee steamed between them. Outside, the neighbor's dog began barking at something and then stopped. Marcus, she started. You don't have to. I want to. It wasn't what you might have thought it was, in terms of I know, he said. And he did know, somehow, or had decided to know, because the alternative required a version of the story where she was simply a person who had done a thing, and that version would not hold the whole person, and the whole person was what he was here about. I know it was something else. I know what it was. She looked at him. What was it? It was the room I left empty. She pressed her lips together. Not at the sentiment, she was past the sentiment, they both were, but at the accuracy of it, at the specific recognition. Yes, she said quietly. That's what it was. They sat in the kitchen until the coffee was gone and then a while longer. They talked about the rezoning project and the medical complex and Ellen's new apartment and ordinary things that filled the room with the texture of two people who had history. Not comfortable. History. Not uncomplicated history, but real history, which is a different and more durable thing. At some point, the conversation reached a natural edge, the place where it either turns into a decision or leaves the decision unmade, and they both felt it. I don't know if I can come back, he said. It was not a threat or a manipulation, just the truth as he currently held it. I want to. I think I want to. But I'm aware I've said true things before and then gone on behaving the same way without noticing, and I don't want to do that to you again. I don't want that either, she said. So what do we do? She looked at the window, at the elm trees and their summer fullness, at the yard they had both moved through for 11 years. I don't know, she said. Something slower, maybe. Something with more. I think we need to learn how to ask each other things and wait for the answer. That sounds like work. It is work. She looked back at him. I think I'm willing to do it, if you are. He sat with that. Not performing deliberation, actually weighing it. I don't want to come back and be who I was, he said. I'd rather not come back at all than come back and be who I was. I know, she paused. I'm not the same either. No, he said. You seem. He searched for it. More present. And yourself. I am, she said. That part I'm keeping. He nodded. He put his mug in the sink and stood at the window for a moment, looking at the yard, and she looked at his back. The particular way he held his shoulders. The thing she had known for 11 years, and felt the full weight of the question between them, which was not, do we love each other, but something harder. Is what we know how to build together enough, and are we willing to build it differently? There was no clean answer. That was the honest thing. He turned from the window. I'm going to go, he said. I want to think about this without the kitchen and the trees and all of it. He tried a small, careful smile. It's too much evidence. Okay, she said. He picked up his jacket from the chair. At the door he paused, and she thought for a moment he would say something conclusive, something that would settle the air, and she both wanted it and didn't want it because conclusive things, she'd learned, tend to close more than they open. What he said was, I'll call you Thursday. Okay, she said, and he left, pulling the door closed behind him with the same careful quiet as January. And she stood in the kitchen alone and listened to his car start in the driveway and pull away down the street and eventually disappear into the sound of a Saturday morning. She stood there for a long time. The elm trees moved in the wind. The neighbor's dog had given up on whatever it was looking for. The kitchen was warm and quiet and entirely hers, and also in the way that the spaces people share retain the imprint of their presence, still somewhat his. She thought, we might not find our way back, and then we might. And she understood, standing in the kitchen with the empty mugs on the counter, that she had finally stopped needing to know which one it was before she could breathe, that the not knowing had its own integrity, that this, the open, unresolved, honest space between two people who had damaged something real and were sitting with the damage without flinching, was perhaps the most truthful thing they had managed in years. She washed both mugs. She put them on the drying rack. She went out into the yard and stood under the elm trees for a while, just standing, just there. In the particular quiet of early summer, when everything is in full leaf and the world is neither beginning nor ending, but simply, persistently continuing.